Matthew 5, the Beatitudes. It's not what we think it is. It's not what we think it is because Jesus is actually accomplishing a specific task that has to do with what's gone on in Israel, in Jewish life. A couple hundred years before Jesus, you had a Greek Hellenistic empire impose pagan practices on the temple. And so this starts the Maccabees and leads to the Hasmoneans. Long story short, through a series of wretched entanglements, you have more and more giving in to pagan Greek ways, which are opposite God's will, the Torah, Oreta, and therefore not just sinful, but they also bring in impurity. They desecrate Israel to the point that the last priest, who is from the family of high priests, a proper Zadokite from Zadok, the high priest of Solomon's time, is exiled and then killed, and then he's replaced by not even a Kohen or a Levi, but by a Binyaminite. So he's not even qualified to be a priest, much less the high priest. And it's basically just a show temple. That you have issues of priests who've married twice. This shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which themselves are from a community of such priests that were exiled, proper Zadokite priests who wanted to keep God's law, and they get exiled out to Qumran, and they kind of take a very exclusive position where they see themselves as the sons of light. But really, it's not that they think of themselves as so great, but that they see the others as sons of darkness. So you have to be baptized and repent to join the Qumran community. They are proper, upstanding Jews practicing God's will, but they find themselves completely removed and completely disgusted by how low Israel has fallen. So they also take vows never to eat unkosher food, and that would be any food that's not from their own community. That's probably why John the Baptist is eating locusts and honey, is it's wild food. In the Qumran text, we even have a technique for how you make locusts kosher by either boiling or putting over fire, so we have a sense of that. That makes sense of John's clothing, his diet, because he would have taken an oath never to eat the impure food of these impure people who are defiled by their temple, because their temple has become a device of defilement instead of being a device of sanctity, which is what the Holy Temple was made to be. This is a real problem. And Jesus doesn't seem to brush it off. There, if you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're reading New Testament, and you're really trying to triangulate it, I think it's hard to think that Jesus just dismissed the concerns, but he also doesn't completely give in to them. So you have this major issue of the temple that is defiled, which means the priest is not doing God's will. So the temple has to be built the way it says in the book, in the holy book. The temple that is the priesthood is defiled. So the priests have become hypocrites, basically. They're teaching the law, but they have manifestly transgressed it in ways that they should have stopped themselves from serving. The law is not being properly taught. And so it gets to a point that the Qumran community says, you know what? I have to save myself. I'm going to go over to the mountain. They put on their mask in the airplane first. Then you've got within, let's say, normal Jewish life, let's go away from the Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls community, you've got Sadducees. Sadducees named themselves after Zadok, whose lineage they cut out of the temple. So they exiled the real Zadokites and became the Sadducees to replace they're usurpers. They're not proper, but they're a priestly group. And then you've got and they are not the good guys in the New Testament. Then you've got the Pharisees and their scribes. So their scribes would be like Levite Pharisees. And the Pharisees are the good guys. I know what we think about the New Testament, but I just think, I don't know, something gets in the way of us reading it. It's pretty clear they're the good guys. When Jesus is talking about scribes and Pharisees, he's talking about them as an in-group thing. So it's like the priest gets up and he starts talking about what hypocrites priests are. How we sit here talking about mercy on Sunday, but how many of our churches actually go out and feed the poor? How many of our churches operate schools that teach children Aramaic and the prayer book? So we talk about prayer with our lips, so we really don't do anything to preserve it, right? I just did it, right? I just, we are damned. We really are just burning everyone. I'm not saying that you should fire me. I'm saying that I recognize the problem. We need to start working on rehabilitating our church as something that's supposed to serve God, right? We can look at this and go, our churches aren't built with a bema and with a small door for the altar, so there's only one priest and 2 deacons. Everyone else is on the bema, and figure out what to do with the icons, and read the gospel in Aramaic, and then put the translation later in the sermon the way it's supposed to be. Give unto God, render unto God what he asked for. If you think of that mentality, right? And you can sit there and really ride the church, but not in a destructive way, in a constructive way of saying, oh, look, this is why things aren't working for us. We're not doing things right. And that's the tone I pick up with Jesus, with the Pharisees. And I'll give you just one pin to hang your hat on. And chapter 23 of Matthew. So Matthew 23. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So he's saying the scribes and the Pharisees have judgment over you. They are your rulers. Listen to them. He's telling his people that the scribes and the Pharisees are the ones in proper, and Jesus is saying this is proper authority. All therefore whatever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Do the Pharisaical teaching. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. But don't pay attention to their own unrighteousness. You do righteousness. The righteousness we all know, they're educated in it. They screw it up in their own lives. But they are saying the right things. They're preserving the teaching, right? Notice who's missing. He doesn't say, do what the Sadducees. No. Sadducees are not Jesus' group. Pharisees are. Do the Pharisaical teaching. But don't do how human beings screw up. Well, that's also included even in my critique. If I'm at some Assyrian priest conference, I'd stand up and say, we're all a bunch of jokers. We don't do these 3 basic things. Learn Aramaic ourselves, make sure that prayers are observed in our churches, and set up schools, starting with groups of 4 or 5. It's very small, build up from our weak level to a stronger level. Now, I wouldn't be seen, I think, as divisive. I'd be seen as someone who has a particular concern. But we still have to preach it, even if we're not going to do it. So I think that's also implicit in that. I think for some weird reason, we have this tendency to try to blow into the New Testament a lot of smoke in our own eyes, so we can't see the dynamics. Because if you read through it with the proposal that Jesus was a Pharisee, a rabbinical teacher of the law, every time someone comes up to him, they're coming up to him as a teacher of the law. You realize that. But that's the setup for Matthew 5. The Pharisees, they're teaching at a high level, which is good. They have to. But the common person's missing. This is where Matthew 5 is not what you think it is. The common Jew is not doing the will of God. And the gospel is you have to do the will of God. Let's get all of humanity to do God's will for him, to live their humanity as what God made you to be, which is a reflection of his will through a motion of your will towards him. He's moved his will towards you and given within his will you the opportunity to reject him. He'd like you not to, and the way you wouldn't, do his will. So Jesus notices that. Qumran are really trying to do his will. Dead Sea Scrolls group. Except his will is for Israel to be a blessing to all nations, and being out in the desert, past the Dead Sea, refusing any kind of communication with anyone else, is not going to help make Israel renewed. They've taken the fact that the temple is defiled, and that can defile them, right? And they've run with it into a direction that's not helpful. Because it's not just you do your will. You do your part for God to have his will done. So they have to do their part to make Israel manifest on earth his will in heaven, God's will in heaven. The Sadducees are complete sellouts. They're just they are, you will be defiled by them by walking in their way. And the people know this, which is why the Pharisees have a place in the temple. That's why Jesus can teach in the temple. Even though Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other, that's why Jesus can teach in the temples, because the Pharisees had this kind of zone of operation within the temple, and it's because the common people would reject them. And you get this in Josephus. So Josephus, Greek, Jewish historian, wrote in Greek. And in his history, he writes about Jerusalem at Jesus' time, and he describes all the groups and everything that's going on. So he describes the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he gives this this information that the Pharisees have this position at the temple, and that the Sadducees wouldn't be able to have any kind of popular connection without the Pharisees. The Pharisees are popular. They're educated. They're basically good, strong ministers. But the average Israelite is not doing the will of God. So we know that Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the Pharisees, they had phylacteries. So if you've ever seen like the boxes Jews will wear on their heads or on their arms, they have phylacteries. They have them in the Dead Sea. There's about almost 30 of them. They're tiny though. They're like a fingertip size. They're not the big, broad phylacteries of the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus mentions. Tying on the phylacteries in the morning, saying your morning prayers, which means that you had a rabbi to teach them because they didn't have yet prayer books. This is still oral tradition. Jesus is an oral tradition religion. There's the Torah, but then there's the oral tradition that comes from it. That the common Jew would keep kosher. And remember, if you think the important things are what you believe or your doctrine or arguing about natures in Christ or ways of salvation or sola scriptura or other things and concepts that would be completely foreign to anyone in the New Testament, no. The big things that you can divide upon are calendar and food. Because calendar means how you worship. So back when this blow up is going on in the temple that leads to those people in the Dead Sea who write the scrolls, the big blow up point, one of them, but like a really major one, is calendar, because they used to have a solar calendar. Jews used to keep a calendar that was a fixed calendar, 364 days, and then every 7 years they would put in a sabbatical year and intercalculate it to keep the calendar regular, so you don't end up with like Passover and autumn. And that was the Jewish calendar. The Greeks come in, they bring in a lunar calendar, which is today's Jewish calendar. And the old Qumran community rejects that, because now you're not going to be celebrating the feast on the calendar that God told you to. So it's important. Calendar means you have to maintain holy tradition. The church is traditionally, and Assyrians, we follow just the civil calendar, which basically until the 60s was the Julian calendar starting in October. So we would always start with Tishrin Kadmaya, Tishrin first, Tishrin 2, Kanun first, Kanun 2. So, and that's until the 60s. Every manuscript, everything is following that. Even Kasha Yosef Qaletas, Kitab Qaryana, I think Tre, he has that calendar, and he talks about that. It's our traditional calendar, and he gives the year from the Greeks, which we use, which is basically to say we're just following the calendar of convenience, and that's a Christian thing, and that may be a reaction about what went on in our faith, and I mean our pre-Christian faith in terms of Dead Sea Scroll, community, priesthood against temple, and the temple's doing the Greek calendar, that's a moon-based calendar, where someone in the temple has to see the moon in a position, blow the shofar horn, and then signals, fires go out, and all the Jewish calendars can adjust. So calendar is important. It's when your feast days are. You can't do Yom Kippur a day early or a day late. Calendar is also unifying the people. It's very important that Israel together do things. So that's the Qumran problem. They're doing the right thing, but everyone else, including the Greeks, later the Romans, with sharp pointing sticks to make people do things that, as a Jew, you're desecrating your source of sanctity, right? Your portal to God is literally having a pig slaughtered in it. Um, so Qumran's solution is to stick and just do the correct thing and wait for God to come down, and they're ready for an apocalyptic war. And I think Jesus agrees with much of what's there, and if you were to read a good collection of Dead Sea Scrolls in the New Testament, you could kind of see how there's a discourse there. But as a teacher of the important things, he's a teacher of the law. He's in this tradition of the Pharisees, and Pharisees are people who want to communicate the law. Jesus is going to take it someplace that Pharisees haven't, which is the common man. So Matthew 5, it's about your common Jew who doesn't have a rabbinical education, which Jesus has. He's a rabbi. He's recognized. Nathan, Philip, they see him, Rabbi. Everyone's calling him Rabbi. He's teaching in the temple. He's teaching in the temple at 12. It means he knows dialects and texts and Hebrew. By the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're writing in Hebrew again. So if he's teaching in temple, he probably knows Hebrew, as in classical biblical Hebrew. If he's impressing the teachers of the temple. So he's coming from this educational elite. Not sure if you would call him aristocracy, good, strong genealogy, but definitely intellectual aristocracy. He's a scion of a very well-educated family, and it makes sense to people that he has this knowledge. Teachers of the law come to him with legal questions. So, and he's going to take it and popularize something that was kind of like, if you think of, Orthodox Jews today. In Brooklyn, you have a yeshiva, you have families that keep a very strictly Jewish life, and they're in a closed society. They're warm, they're lovely people. They like, other kinds of Orthodox Jews, but they kind of do their own thing, and it's hard to penetrate. I think of something like that between Pharisees and the common man. So that's the setup here. Pharisees versus common man. So, Matthew 5. Now think about this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Mourn for what? Mourn for the temple. Mourn for God's presence not there. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? It means you're lacking those things that bring you into the kingdom of heaven, the commandments. You don't have a connection to God. You don't have the wealth of a properly taught son of the kingdom. But Christ says you are going to inherit it. Even though these people are trying to inherit it for themselves, and they you're the ignored people that, are in like the busways and the side streets, the people you overlook. Jesus is saying, you're poor in spirit, yours will be the kingdom of heaven. You're mourning, you will be comforted. You're meek, you will inherit the earth. So he's also talking about a sanctity of the individual. So it's not just doing the law of prayer books and tefillin and these external things, but also the disposition of the soul. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Righteousness means doing God's commandments. Paul understands this. All that stuff Protestants used to talk about, Paul and the law. Look, Paul's doing something that shows up in the Talmud Bavli. There's a question. How are Abraham and Noah, called righteous when they haven't had the Mosaic law? Classic rabbinical question. The issue is you can't be righteous without fulfilling the law, because righteousness equals fulfilling God's law. God's law is the Mosaic law. Paul, and this is something that Rabbi Gamliel will also agree with, and a whole host of others, says that Abraham did what God asked him to do, and that was accounted to him for righteousness. Abraham did what God told him to do. Whatever God tells you to do, you have to do. Doing that will make righteousness. Noah did what God told him to do. If God told Abraham, put Isaac on the pyre, and he didn't, Abraham would be made unrighteous by that. If God told Abraham, to go to Canaan and he instead went somewhere else, that would be unrighteousness. If God told you to go to church on Sunday and you went on Monday, that would be unrighteousness. You do what God asks of you, and that's accounted to you for righteousness. What does it mean to hunger and thirst? It means that you have a difficulty in it. It means you want to be a practicing Jew with a temple, with a good priesthood, but you can't because they're all arguing and chopping each other up and not taking care of you. I'm sure that's never happened in the 2,000 years since then. Blessed are you when you hunger and thirst after righteousness. You just want to say your prayers. You want someone to take your kids, teach them Aramaic. You want to come after work and go into church every day and have slulta. And you want your church to have a no focus in it other than to do God's will for him. And everyone's doing everything but. That's what they were doing. You want to see this kind of connection to the divine brought into our lives right now because we need it. We hunger and thirst after it. They will be filled, is Christ's promise. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So the sight of God, which is something that you would do in the innermost sanctum of the temple, Christ connects it to the purity of heart. The temple is important. Remember, Jesus, when he heals someone, says, go to the temple, make your offering. Jesus teaches Jewish law. That's why he's the Messiah. It's nice that he was born of a virgin. It just said, behold, a virgin will bear a child. What you have to do as the Messiah is teach God's will. Oreta. That's what he's doing. But he's also saying that sight, that divine vision, is available to you. If you're a fisherman or a yokel. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So children of God, it's some language that comes up again in Dead Sea Scrolls, in Qumran. But blessed are you peacemakers, so ones that put at unite things that are opposite. What's the issue? Doing the law like the Pharisees, and even like the Qumranites are saying, because even they're right, and yet we have to have a temple, we have to have a society. All Israel has to participate in this. And we shouldn't really be praying that God is going to send down hosts of angels and slaughter all the Jews except for 4,000 up in the Galilean, up in the Judean wilderness. Better to be a peacemaker. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So those who are excluded, those who are pushed out because they are sticking to God's law. So if you're the priest who sticks to, let's say basically canon law against those that don't, you're blessed. If you're the layperson who sticks to the divine ordinance, to God's word and his will, against the priest who doesn't, you're blessed. The persecution is within Israel. It's within the people, the church. So remember, the word ecclesia really it's a translation of ayata or of kahal. So it's the word that's used in Hebrew for the Jews around Mount Sinai receiving the law from Moses. It's the people of God. The word ecclesia, New Testament, that's all it refers to. Church does not exist yet. Right? There are synagogues. Paul's working out the place of Gentiles in this synagogue structure. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. So again, this is within the community. And here comes the big part that really makes sense. Remember, he's talking to a common Jew. He's talking to these people out on this mountain. What is the mountain like? The mountain is like the mountain where Moses gets the law, right? Out in the desert. Why do these outside of the city mountain or plain discourses of Christ happen there? Because he's taking them back to Sinai. And you even get this multiplication of fish and bread. It's like the manna. God's providing for them out in the desert, and they're getting the law again. It's a restitution. He's making a new covenant. A new covenant, think of it the way that the word brit, the word covenant, and even a new covenant is used by the Qumran community, who also sought for a new covenant. The Dead Sea Scrolls community. They don't mean a new law. They mean a new covenant, as in a renewal of the relationship between God and Israel. So how can they go back now that everything's been spoiled? The temple's spoiled. They can't make sacrifices in the temple. The common Jew is spoiled. We need this renewal, right? So it's a renewal the way I think most Christians feel like we need this kind of renewal. We need this kind of coming back to the sources, coming back to God's will and fulfilling it. And we don't see how we can have that happen, even though individually, all the parts of that mechanism, especially in the Eastern Church, I think they're all good guys, but it's just, the break parts are worn out after a long time. And there's this kind of need for this kind of new covenant with God, this kind of renewal of our liturgy, our prayer, our sacred language, our sacred culture, the things that sanctify our world. They're like that, but a lot more serious because they're dealing with paganism. And so Christ is coming out to this common man, and he's saying to them, ye are the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall the earth be salted? What is he saying? He's saying, you Jews, you who God chose to say his sacred name, that can only be pronounced in that sacred way, because back then they said it, in the morning and the evening, you get to say the Shema Yisrael. You get to pray to God by name. You get to pray to God in the sacred language. You get to put on tefillin. You get to eat kosher. You get to wash your hands for prayer and sanctify your whole world. You to whom God has given his will are the salt of the earth. But if you're not salty, the earth is done for. It's dead. So he's not saying this to Pharisees. Pharisees are trying to get salty, but they've got the advantage of the cultural advantage, right? They in my world, it would be like someone who grew up speaking Aramaic, knows the khudra, knows the qale. Instinctually, Sunday, there's no way he's cutting something. There's no way he's working in his garden. His gas is pumped before Sunday so he doesn't stop. Car's only going to church and back. Knows how to do it. Knows the dukhranane. Tons of culture to serve God. Tons of ways to do something for God. Jesus said, these Kaaba Jews, they have nothing to do for God. They don't know how to do kosher. They don't know how to pray. They didn't grow up with 5 years of yeshiva where they've got all the prayers that were taught through oral tradition. So remember, these weren't really being written down yet. We know oral tradition existed. We know Jesus was in conversation with it because the Dead Sea Scrolls are filled of it. There's some stuff being written down, but you would learn it orally, right? So he's saying, but it's all Israel. It's the bulk. It's the 80%, 90% who are not Pharisees, Sadducees, because they can't even read. Or they have little bits of reading. Or they read, but they haven't had enough training. So Jesus is going to evangelize them, which is another word that shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls with Sin, Beth, Resh. It's sabar. It's the same word in Arabic that translates the evangelizo, sabara, and it means that it's to evangelize. So he's saying that you all have to be, Jesus evangelizing Jews as a Jewish teacher. As the Messiah, his job is to make them good Jews, kosher them, and he's giving them a way of doing the will of God that's accessible to them. That's his whole argument. That's Sabbath stuff, that's food stuff, hand washing stuff. He's being very careful to fulfill the law and the Pharisaical law. Remember, his idea of the law is the Pharisaical law. He doesn't say go to the Sadducees. They don't have Pharisaical law. They don't have oral Torah. Jesus says, do what the Pharisees teach you. Do Talmud. And this is for Jews. But Jesus tweaks it. I don't know if it's tweaks it, but he takes out things that are, with modern Jewish law would say, they're rabbinical teachings. Do the rabbinical teachings as you can. Don't get judged on them. There's certain things you shouldn't be judged on. We have this in the church. A couple days, it's going to be August 1st. Dormition fast. Supposed to fast the Dormition fast. Not supposed to eat meat from now until the 14th. You do it for the Blessed Virgin, for your life, for to sanctify yourself, but you don't get excommunicated if you don't. If I open up my pre-service book, write a confession, it says, for someone who has apostatized, renounced Christ, or eaten meat Wednesday, Friday, or during the Great Fast. Why? Because those are days of mandatory fasting. Everybody does it. They've become basically their oreta, their Bible. It might not be in the Bible. It's the fast of Wednesday, Friday, and Great Lent. It's the Bible. Dormition, it's good to do. It's a blessing to do. Do it for God. Do it for the Blessed Virgin. You'll receive blessings from it. But it's not something that not doing it means that you're no longer participating in the project of doing God's will for him, of oreta. For a Jew, not to do Yom Kippur. You're going to sit there and have a bacon cheeseburger in the middle of Yom Kippur. You've specifically decided to not do God's will with him. You've divided yourself, right? This is why it's disturbing to see someone eat meat during Great Lent. It's specifically a rejection, not only of Christ, but of God wanting his will in the world. This simple thing, 50 days, you don't eat meat. You can do that for God. Well, think of that, right? You're doing something for God, you're doing him the favor of doing his will, because that's how God gets human beings to worship him. It's how he has positive relationships. He lets us have negative relationships, and we can choose to make it positive. See, that's nice of him. And so we can participate in that, and we have all the stuff we can do to participate in it. Except the normal salt of the earth Jew, has to sit here and watch the higher ups. And again, Jesus is one of these higher ups, but he breaks away to go and preach the gospel. The gospel is the Torah made manifest in all Israel, so that then Israel goes and makes disciples of all nations. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So, again, Israel's the light of the world. It needs to illuminate it with God's will so that everyone else can also do the Torah in their way, right? Jews are bound to the Torah in a way. So the way I describe that is, for a Jew, the Sabbath, it's very specific. For a Christian, it's sinful, to sow on Sunday, of course. You shouldn't get your DeWalt out and start making a play, building the addition to the room on a Sunday. But we have that light that comes from those who do God's will very carefully, right? We read the scriptures, but we're not bound with having to have a text of the scripture in Hebrew with the divine name in Hebrew. I don't want that. I like the fact that I don't have to deal with that extra element. And you could imagine, a Jew, he has a scroll that's got some of the most holy words, text in the world, and it's in a box, it's in his tefillah, and it's the same thing that Jesus had. Jesus also would have taken care of this. If you did this today with Christianity, we'd hang them on our rear view mirrors. We'd have our phylacteries, our tefillin on our rear view mirrors. We'd be desecrated by them. We wouldn't just desecrate them, they'd desecrate us, because when you don't take proper due understanding of the sacred, it desecrates you. If you take a Bible, throw it on the, in your car in an undignified fashion, you lose human dignity, because you lose honoring God through that object that's holy. It's holy because of what it contains. Hebrew text, especially handwritten on scrolls, is holy. Conversely, our Assyrian churches are less holy for having printed Gospels. If it was handwritten in classical Syriac on parchment, it would be holier because we would treat it holier. Our due respect for it would make it charge us more with the divine. And it's true, and that's exactly what Matthew 5 is saying. As much as that might sound different than how we normally take it, he's saying, you Jews, you common Jews, you fishermen types, you're the salt of the earth. The Pharisees aren't going to illuminate the world. They can't even illuminate each other. I'm one of them. the Sadducees point to how weak we are. Qumran's good group, but you can't even have, a kosher meal with them. So you're the salt of the earth. You're going to do God's will for it, and then the world is going to imitate you. You're going to be that which makes God's will, like a nuclear explosion, go out in the world. And that's how you know Jesus was the Messiah, because that happened. Pagans stopped being pagan. They became sojourners of Israel, which is what non-Jewish Christians are, right? We come under the law that Acts 15 and Paul, they're using the Noahide laws, and especially the laws of sojourners in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. They're parts of the law for non-Jewish believers. That's what we are. And so we have the Messiah. And so he's telling them, you're going to do God's will for him. That makes you this illumination to the earth. And here's where you really know that this is making sense. 5:17. Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So, I am going to make you keep the law, not destroying it. For in truth I say unto you, until heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Does not mean that the law is fulfilled with Jesus and then something new begins. He's saying he's making you do the law, and you have to do the law until all be fulfilled. All as in the cosmic order. If you still can find sin in the world, you need to do the law, because Judgment Day isn't here yet. If you haven't seen the dead arise universally, you have to fulfill the law. All is not fulfilled. It's nothing will pass from the law, eos ampanda renite, until everything is done. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not jot nor tittle shall pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least commandments and teach men so. So if you screw up the commandments, especially in teaching, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. It will reduce your holiness. You'll be less good for God. You'll be less of what God wants you to be. You will be lower in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So your place in the kingdom of heaven is determined by how well you're able to do the law of God. And yes, there is an element of this that goes to the issue with your common Pharisee knowing more of the law, so being able to complete more of the law, and therefore having a greater position in the kingdom of heaven. And that's why Jesus does the least shall come first, because he's saying the least were not given a huge amount to do, and they did it. The knower was given a massive amount of things to do, and he didn't do it. So, and I'm going to be very interpretive here. So, you can throw this part out if you want. I wouldn't argue either way, but I'd say it's a percentage system. Yokel, who only knows, I don't eat pork, I should say this prayer morning and evening, and, it's wrong to divorce my wife because even if I can legally do it, I'm still liable for making adulteress of her. And I go and do, these feast days in the temple. That can be better than someone who knows all the law and lives a very careful life, but only does 80%. Because this guy knew 4, did 4, got 100%. This guy knew, 618 and did 400. Or he didn't do them well. It's that doing the will of God. Abraham did what God asked him to do. Abraham got 100%. So if you know, but you can't reduce them. You can't stop teaching. See that, and that's what Christ is adding to this. It doesn't mean rejoice you don't know anything. Don't learn anything else, so you're not liable. He's saying you have to learn and teach, but at the same time, there's within that this idea that the one who'd be most learned would be the most advanced. No, everyone is having to get maximal effort, and whatever God gives you to fulfill in righteousness, you fulfilling that gives you your place in the kingdom of heaven. Notice I'm really trying to cut close to this text here. For I am saying unto you, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. One, that means scribes and Pharisees are good, because you don't say, unless your righteousness exceed the righteousness of ISIS. Except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of Stalin. Nobody would say that, because they're, what does it mean to be a little better than Stalin? He's saying that the scribes and Pharisees are righteous, but he's expecting even greater things from the common, unwashed masses of Israel. He expects them to take the leadership in doing God's will for him. He expects them to spiritually master Israel, where the proper authorities, the ones with the black, have failed. So, got about 40 minutes. That's what I wanted to do. I hope that helps. Please feel free in the comments below. I'm also going to put a link to a great book that kind of touches the Pharisee and Jesus question. But I'm going to keep on going with Matthew 5 next, and we're going to go backwards to Matthew 1 after we finish this core teaching section, so we can kind of enter into a more of a historical understanding of what's going on. But also, this is a reading that specifically I think is helpful for understanding the Church of the East, understanding the kind of mindset. This is how I would catechize someone if I could, give them a good functioning Church of the East, where you have at least twice a day prayers, where you have, khudre, you have sources for learning classical Syriac, and all that's going on, and that this is how I would catechize someone. I'd go through Matthew or any of the Gospels and really talk about our church is one where every dukhrana, every ida, every day has its way of makmul pujdana, of completing a commandment, and in completing the commandment of making God's will more manifest in the world, by making his will more manifest in the world, making Christ present, making his kingdom on earth the way it is in heaven. So thank you. God bless. Goodbye.